Good afternoon. We're going to get started. My name is Stephanie Schrader, and I'm curator of drawings and curator of the exhibition Dutch Drawings from a Collector's Cabinet, which if you haven't gotten to see, hopefully this lecture will inspire you to go see. The museum's open today to 5:30. And it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our afternoon speaker. Anne Goldgar is the Garrett and Anne van Hunnick Chair in European History at USC. And she is an award-winning historian, writer, and scholar who has studied the intersection of social and cultural history, art, science, and economics, with a special interest in the history of the book and the history of collecting. So she does it all, and we're so happy to have her here. And Anne graduated summa cum laude from Princeton, and then she continued her education at Harvard for both her master's and her PhD. Shortly thereafter, she served as Arts and Science Faculty Fellow at NYU and as a research fellow at the Clare Hall at Cambridge University. And most recently, she was professor of European modern history at King's College, and she was there for 27 years, and she took up her post at USC in 2020. So we're welcoming her to Los Angeles with her lecture today. And she's written two books that probably will be of interest to you. One is called Impolite Learning, Conduct of Community in the Republic of Letters, 1680 to 1750. And one that is particularly relevant to this topic today, Tulipmania, Money, Honor, and Knowledge in the Dutch Golden Age. And that Tulipmania book has received many awards, and she has given many lectures about it and will captivate us today with another version of that lecture. And I should tell you that her current work, just so you know, we continue to work on topics and they continue to evolve. Her current project is about Dutch national identity through the lens of cultural memory and commemoration of the failed Dutch expedition to China through a Northeast Passage through the Arctic in 1596 to 97. So what we're going to hear today, we're going, oh, I hear a little child making lots of noise out there. Welcome. Anne will touch on today about, we have all heard this wonderful, crazy story about how the Dutch, these sensible Dutch merchants, wildly speculated on tulip bulbs. But Anne's going to sort of, with her extensive research in archives, she's going to disprove that and instead elucidate how Dutch citizens became enchanted by a combination of art and science, and how the crisis over the Dutch tulip trade really emerged from the Dutch seeking inconstant wealth before honor. And before I welcome her to the podium, I have a few housekeeping rules. I need to let you know, this is both an in-person lecture and a hybrid lecture, so welcome to all of you online. And I've been asked to let you know that the closed caption has been enabled, and please access this by clicking the CC icon on your Zoom menu bar at the bottom of your screen. And we will have time for for questions after. We'll join here, and Anne's graciously offered to answer some questions, and we'll alternate between online questions and in the room questions. And we ask, there'll be someone here to facilitate with a microphone. So you ask your question into the microphone so that everyone can hear it, even our attendees virtually. So without further delay, please welcome me and welcoming Anne to the podium and to hear more about Tulipmania.
Thank you, Stephanie, for such a nice introduction, and thank you everyone for coming today. On Tuesday, February 3rd, 1637, a few people were gathered, as so many had been in recent months, to conduct auctions of tulip bulbs at a tavern in Haarlem, a prosperous town just southwest of Amsterdam. Prices for the bulbs had been going up sharply for about 6 weeks, with some of the biggest bulbs for the most elegant flowers going for prices over 5,000 guilders, the price of a brewery on the Sparna, this river running through Haarlem. Unlike auctions up to this point, However, the seller in one of the transactions on February the 3rd was destined to be disappointed. He was trying to sell a pound of tulip bulbs for 1,250 guilders, but even after repeated attempts, no one was buying, not even after the price dropped to 1,000. This immediately caused a negative reaction in the market for tulips, up to this moment so ebullient. According to a pamphlet published that month, the news about the failure to sell at a high price was, I quote, like a running fire, unquote, through all the taverns with auctions going on in Haarlem. And again, I quote, the next day, everything is at a standstill. If we follow the reaction to other towns, we can see that a sale by Andries de Busser on Friday, February the 6th in Amsterdam of a pound of relatively cheap bulbs, which were called Switzers, to Joost van Kuik, was swiftly followed up on Saturday by Van Kuik, who had evidently heard the news about Haarlem, throwing up objections and inventing obstacles to his promised purchase. People who had attended a major auction in the town of Alkmaar on Thursday the 5th, promising to buy tulip bulbs to the tune of 90,000 guilders, also then started to think twice about it. And we can follow the consternation of the buyers in subsequent months as they tried to get out of their contracts before the money came due when the flowers bloomed in the early summer. What was this all about? Because it sounds crazy to us. Why would anyone want to pay a lot of money for a tulip bulb? For us to understand tulipmania, the craze to invest in tulip bulbs in the middle of the 1630s, we need to explore the world of the Dutch Republic in the early years of the 17th century. And more specifically, what people valued about tulips, what kind of people these were, and how the desire for tulips was intertwined with a fashion for collecting, especially the collecting of art. To do this, let's take a few steps back so we can understand the kind of society we're talking about. In the 1630s, the Netherlands was a thriving society and economy that had gone through major changes in the previous decades. It was in the midst of an 80-year fight to gain its independence from Spain, a fight which had begun due to political, economic, and religious reasons in the 1560s, but to all intents and purposes, it was already an independent country in the from the 1580s, and a successful one. The disruption of the war in the southern Netherlands, the part of this map which is a lighter sort of mustard color, which, as you can see, is essentially present-day Belgium, and which was eventually retaken after the fall of Antwerp in 1585, meant that a large number of merchants, craftsmen, and artists who lived in that southern part of the Netherlands eventually made their way to the north, bringing with them capital, expertise, and international commercial connections, which proved a much-needed injection to boost the Dutch economy. From the 1590s, major towns like Amsterdam, Haarlem, Leiden, and Rotterdam, all of which can be seen. Let's see if this is going to work. Oops, that's not what I want to do. Let's go back. Sorry. Close your eyes. Up here, basically, all in this area of Holland. Now you've had a preview of the slides. From the 1590s, major towns like Amsterdam, Haarlem, Leiden, and Rotterdam, all near the prosperous and highly urbanized west coast of the Netherlands, started to grow in population, diversity, and commercial development. The Dutch economy, formerly dependent on carrying goods centered on Antwerp in the south, developed with the twin forces of bulk trade, such as grain and herring, and high-value, small-sized products, such as spices and porcelain, coming from an expanding commercial empire, eventually spanning from the Baltic to the Pacific to Brazil and the West Indies. Wages were high, and even people of the servant class had money to invest in government bonds and shares. Not everyone was well off in the Netherlands, certainly, but in the western part of the country, where most of the political power in the now kingless and federalized country lay, it was populated by many who had money in their pockets to spend on luxuries. Why should flowers have been among those luxuries? We can connect tulips and other flowers with the kind of imperial expansion I've just been outlining, but also with changes in fashion and in intellectual life among scholars, professionals, and the wealthy. The 16th century, with the expansion of European trade and new contacts with other continents, saw a huge increase in the number of plants known to Europeans. Within humanist circles, botany became a central interest. European-wide correspondence networks facilitated the exchange of bulbs, seeds, and information about and pictures of new varieties. Exotic flowers, such as those in this picture by Jakob Fossmar, included the tulip, but also the hyacinth, the anemone, the crocus, the iris, the narcissus, and the grand crowned imperial, which you can see dominating at the top of this picture with its orange flowers hanging down. And these flowers became popular both among botanists and amateur gardeners. And gardening, even at one remove with the help of gardeners, was increasingly fashionable for the humanistically educated nobles and the haute bourgeoisie in the southern Netherlands, as well as in the Habsburg Empire and elsewhere in Europe. It became a badge of education and sophistication to own a garden in which were planted the new exotic flowers, and to talk and to correspond with other people about the fortunes of these flowers in their new locations. Tulips, which had not been seen in Europe previously, were at the forefront of these excited discussions. They had originated in Asia Minor, and by the mid-16th century had long been cultivated and prized in the Ottoman Empire. In the 1550s, they seem to have entered Europe, perhaps via the route of the imperial envoy to the Sultan, although we can't be sure that that's how they got there. But certainly by the 1550s, we hear of the first botanist report of a tulip growing in a garden of a wealthy banker in the German city of Augsburg. Carolus Clusius, botanist to the Habsburg Emperor in Vienna from 1573, became well known for his collection of tulips, to the degree that he was besieged by amateur collectors asking him for samples. He wrote in 1589, and I quote, "No year passes without my handing out to my friends 200 or 300 tulip bulbs which have borne a blossom. This could be annoying. Many people ask flowers of me," he wrote. "I give many of them away, although I also want my own garden to be beautiful. For why should I spend my money and go to trouble if I can experience no pleasure from my own garden? I would have to be insane only to drudge for others." Like the crown imperial, iris, and narcissus, tulips were large, but they had an even greater appeal because of their color and unpredictability. We now know that tulips can suffer from a disease, a mosaic virus. But in the 16th and 17th centuries, people were growing tulips who only understood that they could suddenly change. A solid colored tulip, for example, a white tulip, which is the best kind to start with, could be grown from seed, a process which could take from up to 10 years. But eventually, unexpectedly, it would come up one year with the kinds of stripes, speckles, and flames that you can see here in this still life by Hans Boulanger. This type of variegation, valued in the same way as variety was valued in Mannerist art and in popular materials such as marble and marbled paper. And this is what thrilled those who owned and viewed tulips. The botanist John Gerard in England wrote in 1597 that nature seems to, as he said, play more with this flower than any other that I do know. And another botanist in the Netherlands, Joost van Ravelingen, was rapturous in his description. I quote, "Every year one finds new varieties and sorts which no one has ever seen before. It is yellow, red, white, purple, and as some assert, blue, or 2 or 3 of the colors mentioned are mixed within one flower. That is in the middle, on the sides, or one or the other side of the petals, with speckles, stripes, or spots themselves beautifully embellished. Sometimes the stripes are like flames, or winged, like bunches of flowers or plumage. Sometimes one color shines above the other. That is, the white and the yellow have something red shining through them. One seems like gold cloth, another silver cloth. The excitement of these annotations to a botanical text jumps off of the page." The aesthetic appreciation of rare flowers and the sociable atmosphere of discussion, comparison, and knowledge gathering alerts us to the way this enthusiasm was part of a larger trend, the popularity of collecting. Tulips took their place within the newly fashionable private collections of both professional and amateur scholars in the later 16th century. Cabinets of curiosities, which contain the most beautiful and exotic products, both of naturalia, that is products of the natural world, and artificialia, works of craft and art, were adjuncts to gardens of equally exotic flowers. The kind of passions aroused by the collecting of the strange and the wonderful, a complex of emotions ranging from a desire for learned sociability to an aesthetic appreciation of the beauties of marbling, helped place the tulip firmly within the microcosmic universe of the cabinet. Particularly in the southern Netherlands in the second half of the 16th century, collectors from the aristocracy and the haute bourgeoisie and professions such as lawyers, merchants, doctors, and apothecaries reveled in, talked about, and corresponded about collections of wonders. And with the southern immigration to the northern Netherlands I mentioned earlier, this fashion moved north to the Dutch Republic. The fact that both naturale and artificiale were part of these early modern collections is important for us. Cabinets of curiosities in the period tended to be mixed affairs, with objects such as classical antiquities placed next to natural history objects such as shells, although this mixture was often intended to spark thinking and conversation. In other words, it was deliberate. What we often forget, and what art historians often forget to mention when they're talking about the kinds of inventories of these collections in which art was placed, is that art in the early modern period was frequently collected and also housed in the same spaces as many other collectibles. Inventories with paintings very often included items such as shells, birds of paradise, ethnographic items, and scientific instruments. One outcome of my research into Tulipmania, alongside my friend and colleague, the late Michael Montius's seminal examination of inventories and information about art auctions, was the discovery that people who were interested in collecting art, and this was another fashion that made its way from the southern Netherlands to the Dutch Republic at the end of the 16th century, the people who were interested in collecting art often were the same people who took an interest in exotic flowers. Many of the names in Montius's database of buyers of art at auction, which is held here as part of the Getty Provenance Index, and as well as the Frick as the Montius database of 17th century Dutch art inventories, many of these people who bought art also bought flowers. Indeed, Montius calculated that 67% of the buyers of anemones at an auction of the estate of a dead florist in 1626 also bought paintings at Amsterdam auctions. And if we look at the people who bought tulips in the 1630s, we come across many collectors of paintings, such as the Haarlem lawyer and judge Paulus van Beresteyn, here portrayed by Frans Hals, or Martin Kretzer, a connoisseur celebrated in the middle of the 17th century for his knowledge of painting and patronage of painters. People who bought art often bought tulips as well. In fact, several artists, such as Frans Petersen de Grebber, Jan van Goyen, and Willem Claesson Heda, one of whose still lifes is pictured here, not to mention lesser names such as Joost Janssen van Haverbeek in Haarlem, Simon van Poelenburg and Matthias Bloem in Amsterdam. These also took part in the tulip trade. That is, they were buyers and sellers of tulips. And Heda we can still find in the 1640s dealing in tulips. One reason for the popularity of both of these luxuries, tulips and art, was the very prosperity of the 17th century Netherlands I mentioned earlier. With immigration from the south and a greatly expanded sea, land, and river trade, as well as the development of a commercial entrepot and finishing trades in Dutch port cities, the economic success of the country affected such a large population of the country that high wages attracted workers from many other countries, such as Germany and Scandinavia. Merchants flourished and were able to move up the social scale. What were they to do with their wealth? Well, they could spend it on a house like this, but this house, the Bartolotti House, which is one of the grandest in Amsterdam, was built in 1614 and probably brings to mind the most wealth that one could have at the time. But there is that question in general, what do you do with your wealth? Although, as Simon Schama has argued, the tastes of Dutch merchants remains relatively sober in comparison with the display of wealth we can find among the wealthy in countries such as France and Spain, where you'd find much more fancy houses than the Bartolotti house. But despite this, forms of consumption indicating a sophistication of taste and an understanding of intellectual and artistic trends became popular among the merchant classes of the Western Netherlands, even among the aristocracy. A taste for gardens and flowers and a desire to buy paintings and drawings was for some a result. And in this rather unclear slide, you can see the gardens which were flourishing in the middle of the 17th century on the northern edge of the city of Haarlem. These tastes came together in a new form of art, floral still life. We first find this kind of painting at the end of the 16th century in the southern Netherlands, with painters such as Jan Bruegel, as well as in Spain, which probably acquired the taste through the Spanish court in the Low Countries. In both the southern and northern Netherlands in the 17th century, floral still life flourished. It was on the low end of the hierarchy of artistic taste and price at the time, which valued most history paintings, that is paintings like Belshazzar's Feast here by Rembrandt. That is the kind of painting which gave allegorical or literal tellings of biblical and mythological stories. But still life in general, including floral still life, was popular, in particular because of the way such paintings stress the skill of the artist and the intellectual games one can play with the interventions of man into nature. Such items are isolated from nature by the hand of man, often shown on a blank or a blankish field, allowing the focus of the viewer to play on the item without distraction and to think about the arrangement and its possible meaning. So you can see this here in this painting by Ambrosius Bossart the Elder, where you see that this is far from nature. This is a bouquet in a vase, along with other natural wonders which will have been brought from far away in a relatively blank field in this window. And everything about it tells you that the hand of man has been here, even though it's not visible here. In Los Angeles, we can see many of this kind of paintings. For example, here at the Getty, where, for example, there are other still lifes by Ambrosius Bossart the Elder, for example, this one, and works by the later 17th century floral still life Jan van Huysum, or at the Norton Simon Museum, where, for example, we find this Flowers on a Gilt Tatze by Jan Bruegel the Younger. A particular form of still life, floral still life, emerged from Tulipmania, both as a form of collecting and as an aspect of the tulip trade itself. This can be seen in the form of drawings or watercolors of individual tulips on a blank white field, often on parchment, and therefore relatively expensive. They were painted by some of the most skillful painters of the period, including Peter Holstein, Judith Leister, who painted this Vroege Brabantsen tulip in the 1640s, and Jacob Marel. This style reflected a similar way of representing other natural history objects, such as these insects by Peter Holstein, which allows us to focus completely on the objects portrayed. So there's almost a scientific way of looking at it, although, of course, this is again about the hand of man influencing nature. We can see this type of work in two drawings, which can be seen in the current Getty exhibition, Dutch Drawings from a Collector's Cabinet, which features new acquisitions by the Getty, including tulip portraits by Jacob Marel, which you can see here, and also by an unknown painter in Delft, possibly Jacob Vosmar, whose floral still life we saw earlier in my slideshow. Vosmar was a prolific painter of floral still life, and both of these tulip portraits come from the period around Tulipmania. Marel is of particular interest to us as a painter of this type of work, because from archival materials from Utrecht, where he lived, we know that he himself was involved in the tulip trade, buying and selling tulips. Certainly selling tulips, because here he can be seen, you can see his name with an arrow next to it, attending a meeting of florists, that is people who bought and sold, particularly sold tulips, along with other professions that they followed in Utrecht from the early date of February 7th, 1637. That is only 4 days after the crash that started on the 3rd of February. The point of this document was to decide who among them was going to go to a multi-city meeting of growers on February the 23rd in Amsterdam to discuss what to do about the crash. You can see the names of all of these people. One of them is illiterate, you can see right in the middle, but the rest of them are are perfectly literate. And Marl's signature shows you that this was a person who was used to writing his name. These tulip portraits were often included as parts of books of such watercolors, one of which, the Brandemondis tulip book, is the origin of the second set of tulip portraits in the Getty exhibition. The Norton Simon Museum has an entire such tulip book known as the Great Tulip Book. So you can see these here. These are actually up on the front and the back of the same sheet. And we can see that these would have been part of a book that someone could page through to look at the different tulips. The names often referred to the high value or the quality of the tulip, and sometimes to the name of the grower, such as the Amsterdam silk merchant Abraham Kastelein, or Abraham de Goyer, who are both tulip dealers. There's another, Jan Hendriksen Admiral, who is often referred to here. I can't be sure that that's the case in the Admiral de Admirals de Gouda, because that could also be about the quality. That is the idea that an admiral is someone who's very high up. And you can see that they're named. And what's interesting about these is that the tulips were the first type of flower where individual cultivars are named. And so at the bottom of these sheets, you often see a name, and the name in this case, as with Admiral, Kastelein, and others, Jasper, the name of a tulip grower and breeder who wanted to put his name on the tulip, wanted to brand it with his name. The exact use of these tulip books could have been catalogs of collections for their owners, especially as for all but around 3 weeks of the year, the tulips would not have been in bloom. Many pages of tulip bulbs have prices, and you can see that here. I'm afraid this didn't come out, the prices themselves when I expanded, it didn't come out as well as it should, but you can see that there are prices here, here in guilders, measured in asen. That is, these are bulbs which have been measured in weight. The reason why a heavier bulb would be more valuable is that bulbs will grow offsets. That is, they'll grow little extra bulbs on the side, which can eventually be split off. And so where you bought one tulip, you might end up having 4. And so for that reason, one of the ways in which they were sold was through weight. So but the fact that this is here on this page of a tulip book could suggest, as some people have thought, that this is a catalog for sale. The late Sam Sechal, who was an expert on floral still life, has pointed out that the prices listed were often those at the famous auction in Alkmaar that I mentioned before on February the 5th, 1637, by many seen at the time as the high point of the trade. And I mean, this register of the prices of flowers that you see here came out after the crash because people were supposed to laugh at the fact that people were willing to spend this kind of money on tulips. So this is a satirical pamphlet, but what it does is simply to list the prices of the bulbs so that you can say what a silly thing people had done. So this in itself, of course, in a tulip book could indicate that the tulips owned by the owner of the book had been valued at a high price. So you may by now be wondering how we get from these wealthy collectors of curiosities and art to something that has been labeled a mania, although I would dispute the accuracy of that term. It seems at first sight a far cry from the polite world of collectors to auctions in taverns in places like Haarlem or Hoorn in the 1630s. It's true that many involved in buying and selling tulips in the 1630s, especially at the end of 1636, were not necessarily from the wealthiest families, although we can situate tulip buying between better off craftsmen and some of the most prominent merchants in the towns concerned. We can certainly cite the growing popularity of tulips as a sign of the availability of investment income, perhaps increased by the plague epidemic going on between 1635 and 1637, which would have released capital via inheritance. We can also think that perhaps this is a sign that people wanted to emulate the taste of the wealthier classes, both in flowers and gardens and in the choice of investment activities. So there are various things going on at this time, which helps us to understand how people somewhat further down the social scale might have started to get involved. Now, you will no doubt have heard of tulipmania as one of the crazier events of the 17th century. Mentioned often both in travel guides for the Netherlands, the tulip is now one of its signature icons, and people love to talk about this crazy moment, except the Dutch don't really like to talk about this moment because they think they find it a little embarrassing, although I don't think that they should. And on social media and in popular journalism, we also hear about tulipmania a fair bit. Stories of extraordinary prices have passed down through the years. Tulips worth fortunes, tulips which were expensive enough to buy houses. The insane focus of existence for every Dutch person in 1636 and 1637. Not least because of Gordon Gekko and the film Wall Street, but also the works of famous economists such as Bert Malkiel and John Kenneth Galbraith. Tulipmania is still a byword for greed and thoughtless investment, referred to every time there is a bubble or controversial investment. When dot-com stocks took off at the end of the 1990s, a website was set up called itulip.com, which still runs a discussion forum. The point of this is to warn potential investors against investing unwisely, and references to tulipmania became common in the media. I can't tell you how many times I have been interviewed by newspapers, magazines, radio, television, documentaries, focusing on controversial investments such as GameStop and Bitcoin, or if you go further back, other sorts of investments. Every time tulipmania is mentioned as a comparison because it is seen as self-evidently idiotic. Why would you pay so much for something like a tulip bulb? But was it idiotic? We have already seen ways the tulip bulb was a luxury product, valued for its rarity. Tulips were still extremely hard to come by in the Netherlands in the 1620s and 1630s. It was valued for its collectability, for its accordance with aesthetic principles reflected in other material objects, for its fashionable nature as an object displaying status and sophistication. In Crispijn van de Pas's Blomhof Flower Garden of 1614, which delineates and illustrates some of the currently fashionable tulips, the author actually lists a group of connoisseurs. The word he uses is liefhebbers, the same word that's used for connoisseurs of art, in each of the main towns. So you see he has a lot in Utrecht, some in Amsterdam, Haarlem, and Leiden, although, you know, he also says, actually in another version of this same book, there are lots of others that I still don't know. But he seems to suggest that they make up a kind of club, a club of experts. These are people who are members of the elite. And so they're the kind of people that you might want to emulate. As prices rose during the 1620s and particularly in the mid-1630s, to be able to buy tulip bulbs and to talk about them heralded one's ability to afford and to appreciate this evanescent luxury good. As for those who joined the market as it grew hotter in around 1636, some of these will not have shared the sophisticated understanding of this object, but they will have seen that it appeared to be a good investment for their capital, and they had that capital, as we've seen from looking at the economy at the time. And they also thought that it might be a good investment because there was actually a proliferation of lower price varieties, which were plain, particularly plain yellow tulips, which didn't have this beautiful variegation and striping, but were still there to be bought by people who couldn't afford something as beautiful as these tulips by Marl. It was not for nothing that the States of Holland, the provincial government of the province where most of this was going on, debated placing a luxury tax on tulips in 1636, thinking this was a good way to raise money, an idea that it abandoned in spring 1637 after prices fell. Some purchasers in 1637, unwilling to receive the bulbs on which they had promised payment while the bulbs were buried in the ground, it was customary to pay on receipt in May or June. Some of these people claimed that they had had no understanding of tulips, that is, that they were this type of unwise investor. Although this excuse rings a little hollow coming from one of the people making it, Susanna Sprangers, the widow of a man who had written a treatise on tulip breeding and who was the sister of the great art collector Gomer Spranger. But people with money to spend would have seen a product which continued to increase in price to the degree that in the fall of 1636, that is the autumn of 1636, sellers were reneging on their promises to sell in the way that buyers later would refuse to buy after the crash of February 1637. So people thought that this was a good investment, even if those people were innkeepers and grocers instead of the silk merchants and Muscovy traders who were also involved in the tulip trade. During the course of the period between 1635 and early 1637, we see increased activity and a growing standardization of what was considered to be beautiful and valuable in a tulip. A lot of this discussion took place in gardens, where people who were not at the top of the social scale, but certainly not at the bottom of it, examined each other's flowers and developed a form of expertise which they used in making authoritative judgments about the quality of any particular flower. This type of expertise became institutionalized in committees which started to run auctions in taverns, although many other transactions took place through private notarial contracts between buyers and sellers. These committees, and one is shown in this slide, which were known as colleges or colleges, or comparitsi, which is also the term which is used here. They sat in taverns, judged whether transactions were taking place fairly, even though they actually had no official authority. So they essentially set themselves up as an authority over this informal trade, which is not operating on the stock market, but is operating in this much more private way. At the same time, I found that several companies were formed to sell tulips, making contractual arrangements among participants about the provision of capital and the division of profits. I found several such companies in Amsterdam and Haarlem and one in Enkhuizen. But many people simply bought or sold one bulb, or on the less wealthy end of society, traded bulbs for items like a dress or a silver spoon. And one way that you might do this might be to go to a notary and have a notarial contract drawn up, or in the case of this particular transaction, simply draw up a little sheet in which an IOU is made. The reason that you need an IOU, as I mentioned, is that we're in February, the bulbs are all in the ground, they're not available to be traded. And so what would happen is that the person who was buying would promise to pay when they got the bulb in May or June, when it was dug up after it had flowered, and the person who was selling would promise to give the bulbs. That timing is important because it helps us to understand the timing of complaints about tulipmania. So here we see this koopcedule, which is a kind of IOU written to record a transaction between Wouter Tullikens of Haarlem and Peter Willemsen van Rosven of Alkmaar, where he says that he will pay 2,200 guilders for half a pound of a kind of tulip, which is popular at this time, called Cornhart. And he did so on the late date, rather late for him, of the 30th of January, when, as we know, in 4 days, the crash would take place. It's not clear why, on that date, February the 3rd, 1637, that pound of bulbs in a Haarlem tavern, which in any case we only know about from a contemporary pamphlet, why did it fail to sell? We don't really know why. The pamphlet itself says, where it comes from, people scarcely know. It falls like a downpour in the summertime. Economists who have not directly studied the documents of the trade, that is, most of them, and its attendant documents have suggested that this was due to the entry of people without investment experience into the trade, a lesson which they used to suggest investment advice, but which stems from the rhetoric in the 1637 documents deploring the involvement of poorer people in financial activities, which could make money without investing any labor. So there's that message which is coming from the time saying, you know, poor people who don't really know what they're doing, they shouldn't get involved, and you will still see that on the internet today. But in my view, this fails to explain the loss of confidence in the trade, not least because there was little criticism of the trade while it was going on. It may be that purchasers started to worry about whether the steep rise of prices during January 1637 could be maintained. Or it could be that the oversupply of bulbs coming from the more popular trade flooded the market. This was suggested in the 17th century, but it's hard to sustain because in February 1637, there were no more bulbs in existence than there had been in September because they'd all been buried in the ground. So there was no way to see that there were more bulbs. However, it may be that the knowledge of a larger quantity of bulbs joined together with the uneasiness of investors about the rise in prices helped to cause this loss of confidence. In any case, by the end of the first week of February, prices fell, apparently to less than 10% of their previous level. We know this because of the fact that one of the things which was attempted to do about it suggested that prices should be at least at 10% of the original level, which suggests that they're trying to make things better for themselves than they actually were at that point. Now, when the crash came, the institutionalization that I've mentioned didn't do much to solve the disputes that arose over the money owed. Because since it was February, as I said, the bulbs were all buried in the ground. They were to be dug up and exchanged later. And so it puts it all off, but that doesn't mean that people aren't still upset and worried about it. As I mentioned, the artist Jacob Marl and 36 other dealers joined together in Utrecht to organize joining province-wide discussions taking place in Amsterdam on the 23rd of February, which ultimately demanded that any deals made before the end of November 1636 should go through. But then the prices had risen so much since then that they suggested that any transaction after that date could be rejected by the buyer, who would then have to pay 10% of the purchase price. So actually, that's not such a great deal for buyers because they will still have to pay something. And this is traditional in Dutch society. It's a concept which is called rouwkoop, grieving money, which is a fine for not going through with the transaction. Well, they're suggesting that somebody should not get the bulbs that's offered to buy them, but that they should have to pay 10%. Authorities in the various towns couldn't decide what to do, however. Not everybody could agree on this. In fact, Amsterdam, which had called the meeting, refused to sign this particular document. And buyers and sellers tried to get local officials to rule on the situation in this very federalized country where most of the power lies with the towns. But they really couldn't come to any kind of solution. The provincial government was also unclear about what to do. It sent the question to the provincial court. The provincial court didn't know what to do, and they sent out this proclamation, of which this is a copy. Oh, sorry, messing up again. There we go. They issued a proclamation on April the 27th saying, very weakly, saying, the best thing to do is just to try to get people to agree, okay? They said, let's take the viam concordia, the way of concord. Well, a pointless thing to ask people to do because, you know, some people are dealing with really a lot of money. They didn't want the judicial system to get flooded with these cases. And they said, look, try to just come to an agreement, okay? And as time moved on into the summer of 1637, things started to heat up again because that's the moment when the exchange of bulbs for money should have taken place. Sellers sent notaries to buyers to remind them to pay up. They had to go and stand outside their houses and read a document that said, you now have to do this. And when they did so, they got the same answer from many people, which is, oops, I shall do as another has done. Ik zal doen als een ander. I'll do what another has done. Well, what that means, of course, is no one else is paying, so I'm not going to pay. Forget it. The same thing happened in September, where once again we have a moment of crisis, because that's the moment when, according to what people understood about bulbs, and as far as I know, what people understand about bulbs now, is that you dig them up during the summer, you dry them out, and then you bury them again for their own health, and they stay buried until the following summer. So at that point, the bulbs are about to go back into the ground, and sellers are saying, come on, you have to take the bulbs, I need the money. People saying, no, I will do as another has done. No real financial solution was arrived at except locally, and even that failed to work in many cases. And in January 1638, so we're moving now, we're on a year later now, Haarlem, the center of the trade, created a commission for flower affairs, which was intended to soothe the quarrels of the tulip trades and the crash had incited. As with the provincial court and in the tradition of Dutch culture at the time, the idea was to use arbitration and discussion to solve problems. Specifically, it tried to get back for sellers a rouwkoop, a fine for not buying, going through with the purchase of 3.5% from buyers that the commission decided owed this fee. But often the parties to contracts ended up in the small claims court because having been told that they have to pay this, they didn't want to. And so then they got taken to small claims court because the buyer refused to pay even the smaller sum. So that meant that quarrels continue to bubble over as we go into the 1640s. Now, popular cultural accounts of tulipmania tell us a number of stories about tulipmania, which I want to talk about. First, of course, is what we've already said, that this is a crazy trade because no one with any sense would get involved with this kind of transaction about such a stupid thing to buy as a tulip bulb. So as with other myths about tulipmania, this discourse started in 1637 when a range of popular songs and pamphlets, like the one that we're seeing here, was published to make fun of the people who had been involved in the trade. I've only found one song like this from before the crash. So nobody was really saying anything about it until the crash. But at that point, people really launched into ridicule to the point that in Harlem, the city council said that booksellers had to stop selling these and they should be burned. Fortunately, they weren't all burned because we still have them. Among this contemporary pamphlet literature, there are constant complaints about overestimation of the tulip's value, this whole idea about value. Why was it valued more than other flowers? And you even get complaints from other flowers voiced in these songs saying, I'm a daisy, why do you think a tulip is so much better than me? The songs also say, look, it doesn't have any medicinal value, which is a major way that plants were valued. It doesn't even have any scent. If there are tulips with scent now, they've been developed since. It was ridiculous, one song pointed out to, and I quote, give 4,000 guilders for a flower which in the judgment of truth is actually worth half a stauver, that is basically like a penny. And yet it was valued more than riches, these songs said. Compared to it, gold and diamonds were dreck. I don't need to translate that word, I assume. This discourse raised questions about whether, in fact, other things, God, for example, but also other luxury goods, should not be valued more than tulips. This debate, which ignores the laws of supply and demand, which help to set the price, and the fact that anything is worth what someone somewhere will pay for it, is directly reflected in the discourse about tulipmania today. So we still hear this is insane because people say there's no reason to pay this much. You pay this much because someone will buy it for you from you for that price or for a greater price. Now, the fact that this discussion is reflecting things that come from the 1630s isn't surprising, because the discussion of tulipmania we inherit from the famous economists is based on a line of succession of texts going all the way back to 1637, with an important stopping point in this book, Charles Mackay's Extraordinary Popular Delusions in the Madness of Crowds, an 1841 text, which is still popular, still in print, but which shouldn't still be popular and shouldn't still be in print because it's full of misinformation. Mackay's text was based on a German book from 1797 called The History of Inventions, which was based on a Dutch text from the 1670s, which itself goes back to the pamphlet literature and the songs of the 1630s. So in other words, what we are hearing in these stories now that circulate on the internet, and Mackay is often cited, these are the voices of the 1630s, complete with their values. These are the social views of hundreds of years ago, yet these are echoed today. So when we hear that everyone in the Netherlands was involved in this crazy trade, which is another claim which is made, that the people who bought tulips were bad people who were interested only in profit, not in value, that they consisted mainly of poor weavers who were getting above their station, we are hearing a warning, the warning of itulip.com, but also of the pamphlets and songs of the 1630s, that it's a mistake for the wrong people to get involved in speculation. We've already seen that there were good cultural and economic reasons to do with the luxury trades, knowledge communities, expressions of sophistication and status, why people at that time would have bought tulips or bought pictures of them, like this Jacob Marl. Although from hindsight, we can see that there was no real reason to expect tulip prices to go up indefinitely because there had never previously been a market crash, and this particular crash did not take place on the stock exchange, as I said, because tulips weren't traded on it, though there was a stock exchange. People had no prior experience of a dramatic fall in prices. It was a reasonable thing for them to invest money in something for which one could expect a good return, whether that was a bale of wool, a barrel of beer, or a tulip. However, popular accounts of tulipmania also tell us that the Netherlands suffered greatly from the folly of the craze, with the wide participation of the public in the trade, throwing many into bankruptcy and the country into depression. This is also untrue, and part of the same set of financial warnings later economists and writers chose to make about tulipmania, starting as early as 1720 in the South Sea bubble. And you can see in this cartoon, Floris Gekskap, which was published in 1637, that it was republished in 1720 because of the South Sea bubble. And there are numerous references in the plays and other literature which came out in 1720 to tulipmania. So people remembered it 90 years later, and they had something to say about it. They're already saying what's happening now is crazy, like that tulipmania. Despite the claim from 1637 that everyone, particularly weavers, the main artisanal group in Haarlem, was involved in the trade, this was not the case. Although I wasn't able to identify everyone in the cities I studied who took part in the tulip trade, I found something like 285 people in Haarlem who bought and sold tulips out of a population of about 42,000. In Amsterdam, which in 1637 had 120,000 inhabitants, I found only 60 tulip traders, although I think that's a great underestimation, which comes from the nature of the records available. In Enkhuizen, another city I studied with around 22,000 inhabitants, I found about 25 people involved. So, I mean, these are only the people that I was able to find during my research, and I'm sure that there are others, but still, we are not talking about anything close to the populations of these towns. It would be crazy to suggest that everyone is involved. So although these figures underestimate the true total, we can be confident the numbers involved in tulipmania were relatively small. Many were easily identifiable and often substantial citizens, and they can be connected to each other, and I have done so by, for example, living in the same neighborhood, belonging to the same profession, being connected by marriage. There are lots of brothers-in-law who were trading together. Also religion. I found a lot of Mennonites who were involved in the trade, mostly trading to non-Mennonites. Nor, despite the rhetoric, was the outcome of tulipmania bankruptcy and depression. Although the bankruptcy records for this period are patchy, it's difficult to find any bankrupts at all associated with tulipmania. One man in Vianen during tulipmania fell into severe financial difficulties in 1646. But the whole reason he was living in Vianen during tulipmania was that he'd already gone bankrupt years before the tulip crash. And for jurisdictional reasons, Vianen was one place where your creditors couldn't touch you in the Netherlands. In fact, there was a slang phrase at the time, which is to go to Vianen, which means to go bankrupt. Few others went bankrupt in the late 1630s, but in most cases, it seems unlikely to have had anything to do with tulips. The place that we find tulip traders in the bankruptcy records after the crash is when they are buying up the houses and property of other people who are in financial difficulty. So far from being bankrupt, they're preying on those who are bankrupt because of some other reason. And we see their names appear repeatedly. Of those in the towns that I've studied who spent more than 400 guilders on a tulip, and that actually comes to only 37 people, nearly all were wealthy merchants. The wealthiest people were the ones who spent the most on tulips, and they could easily bear this loss. We can find some of them, such as the merchant Hans Bart in Haarlem, still involved in trading tulips in the 1640s. As for a provincial or national depression, there was no sign of this if we examine the economic evidence. The concern with weavers, who in fact make up hardly any of the accounts of tulipmania I've been able to find in notarial and judicial archives, I would suggest comes from, again, the 1630s and the fact that there are so many weavers at the time. There were people at that time who were worried about the possible social and cultural effects of rapid social advancement without any discernible work being put into it. As I mentioned at the start of this talk, the Netherlands at this time was a fluid society in which social mobility was possible for those who brought capital, knowledge, and a willingness to work to the cities of the West. This social mobility happened over a series of generations, and with workers flooding in from other countries, such as the German lands in Scandinavia, to take advantage of high wages, the changes in society seem to have made some people in the middle classes uneasy. Some of these were people making representatives to city and provincial governments about tulipmania, saying, do something about this. We have to make sure that people go back to their trades. We need to make sure that people get their money back. Others were members of chambers of rhetoric, pictured here in a rather jolly representation by Jan Steen. These were chambers of rhetoric were poetic and dramatic societies, which would have contests and enjoy writing and putting on plays and simply basically enjoy themselves. And from what I can find, it appears that these are the groups, particularly in Haarlem, but also in other towns like Hoorn, for example. These are the people who are involved with writing these songs, making fun of the tulip trade, making songs to ridicule people was a very common thing to happen in the Netherlands in the period, and we have a rich seam of these for tulipmania. So what are they worried about? Well, the fact that workers like weavers, even if they weren't necessarily involved, workers like weavers might end up wearing fancy clothes and ride around in coaches. In one song that I found, which I don't think had been known before, there's a refrain which suggests where a woman who is married to a weaver says, I will dominate, we will dominate. I'm looking forward to dominating. This was frightening for people for whom society was already changing enough with the kinds of changes of immigration and social rise of people as the country changed really dramatically in its economy and society. So with the new accoutrements of wealth, they thought there would be no way to tell the lower classes from themselves. Already with tulipmania, one song says, we've been mixing too much with these people. We've had to do with people that normally we would have nothing to do with. And so, you know, we need to be careful. And the best thing would be that these weavers would go back to their looms and that everything goes back to normal. And we find the same types of sentiments being expressed in petitions to city councils of places like Haarlem, for example. The idea that the social order has been completely turned upside down and that everyone has abandoned labor in order to simply try to live on investment income. This concern about a potential overthrowing of the social order is, I would argue, a reason why we can call tulipmania a crisis, even though it was not, in fact, an economic crisis. Another reason was the fact that after the crash, buyers refused to pay up, saying, I will do as another has done, was all that buyers would say when notaries came to them in June 1637 demanding payment. This was in a culture where debt and credit obligations were a crucial way that people in the community, a highly commercial community, were bound together. And yet people were refusing to live up to these obligations. They're just saying, no, no one else is doing it, so I'm not going to do it. They ought to be ashamed of themselves, the lawyers for the sellers of the 90,000 guilders worth of tulips in Alkmaar said about the non-paying buyers. This failure to pay overturned the way that society worked. And although it was not a long-term crisis, it made people sit up and take notice. The result was ridicule and an articulation of social values that we hear directly repeated whenever someone mentions tulipmania when they write about Bitcoin. But these were the social values of the 1630s, not of 2022. Tulipmania was a fascinating moment in Dutch history, one that reveals to us a great deal about how society at that time worked and why it invested in art. We can learn from this story about how government worked, how society worked, what people thought was important, what its tastes were, why it invested in art. We can learn from this story about how migration altered and improved the economy and society of the Netherlands and revamped its social system. Tulipmania makes a wonderful window into a culture that produced and consumed vast quantities of art, some of which we can still enjoy today. With tulipmania, we have a moment that reveals the importance of fashion, of emulation, and of ways of demonstrating status, knowledge, taste, and connections. We can see from this incident how relationships among people in various neighborhoods, craft guilds, religious groupings, and social classes played out culturally and socially in a period of social strain. But studying tulipmania closely also reminds us that it was in the past. And as L.P. Hartley famously wrote, the past is a foreign country. That's what I try to tell journalists who call me to ask me to compare tulipmania with Bitcoin, but it doesn't always work. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions, and Stephanie will come up and join me, I think.
Take note of that drawing up there.
Yes, this is one of the ones from the show.
So, got a question right there. Do you mind speaking your question? Speaking
Into the mic.
into the mic.
This does work, right?
As I understand it, the trading in tulips is like future contracts, and they trade over and over, and it's really only the last person that ever takes delivery. But one thing I had read about the market at Harlem was that in 1637, it was severely affected by buyers, maybe wealthy buyers, who didn't show up because of the presence of the outbreak of the bubonic plague. Would you comment? Is that a significant factor?
I don't think that's a factor. The plague epidemic had been going on for 2 years. In fact, it already was pretty much over at this point. Well, it was ending at the end of 1636. And, you know, the people who were trading were all in the epidemic. And yet, I mean, interestingly, I don't really find any kind of hampering of interaction among people because of that. I haven't found any evidence that suggests that buyers didn't show up to take possession. And indeed, by the time that would have been an issue, which would have been in June of 1637, you know, the plague epidemic was over. So, I mean, you're right, although I would not call it a futures trade because it doesn't work the way futures do now. It's about buying something in the future, but the price is set at the moment that you buy it, which is not the case with products which are sold in futures. But you're right that the person who last has the bulb is the one who's left with it. And so those are the people who tended to lose out because they couldn't sell on. But yeah, I don't think that the plague had the only way that I think that the plague had an influence was that I think that injected extra capital into the economy because it had been going on for several years. There were people who by that time had inherited some money from dead relatives and might have been able to invest it in this way.
Okay, I'm going to take one first from the online participants. So there's a question from Carol O'Connor saying, were there thefts of bulbs recorded before the crash? Were people digging up tulips?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, there were a lot of thefts in the 16th century. I mean, Clusius, whom I mentioned before, who became the head of the botanical garden at the University of Leiden, he multiple times had tulip bulbs stolen, and other people that he knew did as well. I mean, it was certainly an issue, and people had all kinds of devices that they concocted in order to try to prevent this from happening, because it was a fairly obvious thing to steal. But of course, anybody who knew anything about tulips would know that it wasn't very good for them to dig them up out of season. And in fact, there was some very well-known, indeed part of the city government, people in Harlem who bought some bulbs in January from someone in Wassenaar, which is near The Hague, and they were transported to Harlem. And their gardeners said, "Look, we told them that this was going to mess the bulbs up," and they then turned out not to be as good as they had thought, and then they tried to sue. So it wouldn't have been a good idea to dig them up, except at that point in the summer. But yeah, interesting question.
Okay, I think you had a question down here.
I was wondering, I noticed this prices, there was everything from 80 to 1200 to 5400.
Yeah.
The highest price I saw. But what would that be the equivalent in today's dollars, I wonder?
Okay, well, all of those prices are 80 guilders is, well, if you imagine that a skilled worker would earn approximately a guilder a day. So we are talking about a lot of money when we're talking about 1,000 guilders or 1,200 guilders. As I said, however, I found only 37 people who had spent more than 450 guilders on tulips out of all of the transactions that I found. And so, I mean, actually what's interesting in that pamphlet, which gives the list of the prices in Alkmaar, what's surprising is that a lot of the prices aren't that high, and that the highest one ever is in that auction, which is 5,500 guilders for one tulip with offsets. And but that was way above what most tulips would cost. So the 80 guilders, that's a substantial investment for a person who isn't very wealthy. But there were plenty of tulips that were sold at that sort of price, you know, and that's not the kind of price that people who make the myths about tulipmania refer to.
Well, this is an interesting question, which I don't know the answer. I would love to know if you know the answer.
Okay.
This is a question. How and when did Holland, Michigan latch onto tulips as a draw for tourism and commerce for that area?
That's a good question. I mean, as far as I know, Holland, Michigan was founded in the middle of the 19th century by a Catholic priest who brought all of his followers over there to settle. I mean, that's something similar happened near where I'm from in Wisconsin. When they started to latch onto the tulips, I don't know, but I would imagine it would be somewhere. I would guess that, given just the way that cultural politics work in the US, that it might have been somewhere around 1900, but that's total guess. Interesting
Future
question,
research.
though. Future research, yeah.
In the archives of Holland, Michigan.
Exactly. Yeah, no, it shouldn't be actually be that hard to find out. And people have written about Holland, Michigan specifically.
I'm sure the tourist board of Holland, Michigan.
Yeah, but there's actually a book called Ik mis alleen de Hema, called I Miss Hema, which is a wonderful sort of dime store in the Netherlands.
The Target of the Netherlands.
Oh, but it's better. I love Hema. But anyway, which is about the Dutch diaspora to America, and a lot of it's about Holland, Michigan, which is how I know this. So,
is there another question? Oh, there's two more questions.
You mentioned someone who was a tulip trader in the 1640s, and that there is we've seen a couple of artworks which are dated into the 1640s. Obviously, to those people, the tulip had some value, had some beauty. So can you say something about the value of tulips as a cultural object beyond the ridicule in the 1640s?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I really don't think there, you know, if you Google tulipmania, you'll find all sorts of stuff. And one of the things that people often say is people hated tulips after this because it was so, you know, because it caused so much, they caused so much trouble. And I mean, this is obviously not the case. It's evident that they continued to be valued, not only in the Netherlands, of course, but also in other countries, that people continued to grow them. They continued to make it into floral still life. I mean, if you look at the Van Huysum still life, that I think there are two Van Huysums in the Getty, which are from sort of the 1670s, 80s. You know, they're full of beautiful tulips, which look a bit different because they're a bit like Olive Van Huysum and lots of floral still lifes. They're kind of like this. They're sort of, you know, everything looks a little, all the flowers look a little old and sort of collapsed. But you know, they were still valued. And I mean, obviously, we know that the Netherlands becomes, as it was not in the 17th century, the center of the world flower trade. And, you know, if you go to the Netherlands now and you go to Alsmeer, where the big tulip auction house is, you know, you see the huge quantities of tulips and other flowers which are being sold. That industry had to develop, and it's already developing in the later 17th century. And you can find English gardeners going over to the Netherlands to buy flowers, or sending to the Netherlands in the 18th century. You know, a similar thing. Although at that point it's the hyacinth, which is the favored flower. But you know, this turned from this turned the Netherlands into a country which made a lot of money off of this, even though tulips were also grown in England and in France and many other countries. And so, I mean, I have not done the research, I have to admit, on how that transformation comes about. But it obviously happens, and it's, you know, fascinating if you have the chance ever to take a tour of Aalsmeer, you know, watching, you know, such a big warehouse that people go around inside on bicycles and roller skates in order to get from one side to the other. It's absolutely huge as people sit there all day long bidding on tulips, according to a Dutch auction, which means starting at the top at a high price and then going down until somebody stops the clock. So it's a fascinating industry. Thank you.
I have another question here from someone who I believe must be a gardener. So you always get the economists asking her questions
Gardeners.
and gardeners. I've always understood that the collapse of the tulip trade is linked to a fungus that created the stripes and eventually killed the bulbs. Is there any truth to this?
The reason that the flowers changed to become striped is that they had a virus, which is called a mosaic virus. This was discovered only in about 1900. People in the 17th century didn't know this, but they wished that they knew what it was. They were desperate to find ways to make the flowers do this, because that's what made them sell. That's what made them beautiful. However, they also knew that this was a sort of swan song, that the tulips wouldn't last that much longer. And so it made it quite a precarious trade. That is not, however, the reason that the trade, that the tulip trade crashed. That remained the way in which tulips were changed. But I mean, it's very funny to see the kinds of things that they tried to do, like cutting bulbs in half and dyeing one half one color and one half another color to see if they could make it go stripy and so on. And none of this worked, of course. So yes, the idea that there's a virus, not a fungus, but a virus, is true, but that's not why the trade collapses.
Do we have another question?
Yeah, there's somebody there.
Hi, I have a question on finance or a question on politics. Which are you more comfortable answering about of the
Whatever you like.
Okay, so I know a lot of artistic styles and gardens went from sublime port to Italian, Venetian, and other things, and spread out, at least in the French gardening tradition, to France that way. How did the tulip emigrate to the Netherlands, and was there any political ramifications? Was the flower ever symbolic of things other than just being aesthetically beautiful? Just like the gin craze was patriotic British people not drinking French wines, etc.
Yeah, well, I mean, tulips, it's not totally clear how tulips got to the Netherlands and how they got into Europe at all. I mean, we can see that there are tulips of various kinds which come into southern France, for example, around the same period of the middle of the 16th century. It's often said that a guy called Busbeck, who was the Habsburg emperor's envoy to the Sultan, that he brought them back in the middle of the 1550s, and that he certainly was the person who gave them to Clusius. Clusius brings some to the Netherlands, but they're already in the Netherlands before Clusius moves there from Vienna in the 1590s, I think it is. I may be getting that wrong. So, I mean, they may have come through trade, or they may have come through sort of being passed from hand to hand among wealthy people. That's not clear. I mean, certainly they're in Germany at the court in Vienna, and while Clusius, who before he went to Leiden was the sort of gardener to the main chief gardener to the Habsburg emperor, he is already getting these demands for tulips because he's growing them in his own garden. In terms of your question about what kind of symbolism it had, it's not clear to me that it ever had a political symbolism in the Netherlands, other than to be, a sort of a symbol of the country, something that people, were proud of as a product, which they already were well before Tulipmania. I mean, interestingly, in 1612, when the when the Dutch sent a large diplomatic gift to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, which included huge amounts of, cheese and cloth and so on. And Stephanie's and my friend Claudia Swan has just written a book in which she talks all about this diplomatic gift. One of the things which is interesting is that they send tulips there as a Dutch product already in 1612, when of course the tulips only 60 years earlier have come from Turkey. But, they knew that tulips were very favored. I mean, the period in the early 18th century in Turkey, it was known as the tulip age, because, it was absolutely the way to become politically powerful in Turkey at that time, was to know something about tulips. But I can't find any indication that this is anything other than a product that has made money for the Dutch and that they have found pleasant. But what I noticed when I started working on this topic was that very few Dutch historians wanted anything to do with it. I don't mean that they wouldn't talk to me, but that they hadn't worked on it. That there was an economic historian who had published some documents in the 1920s, and there was a tulip executive, sort of somebody who was fascinated by the history of tulips, but also ran a big tulip company in Haarlem, who wrote two books, actually, one about Tulipmania and one called, 400 years of tulip export, of bulb export. He wrote about it in the 1940s. Nobody else had written about it. And that did make me wonder about whether the Dutch found this an unpalatable episode, because it made them sound stupid. And, I don't think that it makes anybody sound stupid. I think that it's a very understandable thing to have happened, considering the tastes and the economy and the society of the time.
I think we're going to finish with one question online, if that's okay. The question, and I don't actually know the answer to this question, would the tulips be cut and enjoyed in vases by their owners, or just enjoyed in the garden? That's
a really good question, and I don't really know the answer. I mean, if we see these floral still lifes, you can see that, because of this idea of the intervention of the hand of man into nature, that there are almost always, I can think of only one example by Jacob Gerritsen Kaup, a picture in the Dordrecht Museum, where the tulips are growing in the ground. Otherwise, you always see them pictured in a vase of some kind, or on a table or something, or in a basket or something like that. It's hard. Well, they must have got the idea from somewhere, and clearly there were bouquets of flowers that people were putting in their houses. Although, if you look at those bouquets, and this is well known to people who work on floral still life, those bouquets are impossible to actually put together, because the flowers don't bloom at the same time of the year. This is another way in which it's a kind of witty way of talking about it. It couldn't happen, and in fact, many of them are so unbalanced that if you actually tried to do that, they would tip over. I don't know whether people had bouquets of flowers in their houses, bouquets of tulips. If I had been someone who was growing tulips, then I wouldn't have done that, because, you want it to, you want to enjoy them as they are. On the other hand, the one thing I will say, and I don't know whether they knew this at the time, but nowadays, those of you who are familiar with tulip culture now will know that in the Netherlands, where they grow tulips in big fields, which are amazing to look at, these big stripes of one color or another, they'll go through with a fine machinery and they'll lop the heads off them all. And the petals will all be on the ground. And the reason for that is that the bulbs sell for more than the flowers do. And if you let the bulb grow for too long, then the nutrients will be extracted from the bulbs, and the bulbs won't be as good. And so, yeah, I mean, if you were living in 1636 and you wanted to know what to do with your bulbs, you'd have a problem on your hands, because, in order to make your bulbs extra good to sell, you might want to cut the flowers off. But on the other hand, it's in the garden where the experts are coming to take a look at your flowers. So that's a long-winded saying that I don't know the answer.
Well, thank you so much. And I hope you all, every time you look at a painting that has a tulip, or a drawing that has a tulip, you think about this conversation, because it does you know, we walk by flower paintings and think, oh, nice tulips, but there's so much more to that story. And also when you buy the tulips and you watch them, I'm always fascinated with the fact you cut the tulip, you put it in, and they grow.
Yeah.
They continue to grow. So they're really an extraordinary flower that has an extraordinary history. And we thank you so much for
Thank you.
elucidating that.
Thank you for having me. Okay.